The world was old. Millions of years had already passed. Dinosaurs were not new to the Earth, but the Earth itself was about to be reborn. They walked upon a single vast land, a supercontinent stretching from pole to pole. Its name was Pangaea. This immense unity had defined life for an eon. It was an ancient, unbroken world. Now that world was beginning to fracture. Deep within the planet, a slow fire burned. The mantle churned with unimaginable force. Heat and pressure sought release. They pushed upward against the rigid crust. The land, once a solid sheet, began to groan. Tectonic forces, patient and relentless, were at work. They pulled the continents in every direction. It was a process measured in centimeters per year, a speed imperceptible to any living thing. Yet over millions of years it was unstoppable. Every crack, every rift, every shudder rewrote the world. The changes were not just geological, they were biological. Life itself was being pulled apart and reformed. This was the era of a shattered Pangaea. Its breaking would determine the future of all life. The engine of this change lay miles beneath the surface. It was a world of molten rock and crushing force. Over tens of millions of years, the pressure had built. It warped the thick plates holding the continents together. Magma, superheated and desperate for an escape, surged upward. It found weaknesses, deep fissures in the crust. Vast volcanic provinces were born. Lava spilled across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. These were not simple volcanic cones. They were floods of fire burying the landscape. One event stands out in the deep history of our planet: the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. It was one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history. Its scars are still visible today in the rock. The eruptions marked the beginning of the end for Pangaea. They also marked the dawn of the Jurassic. The supercontinent began to tear itself in two. The rift followed what would one day become the Atlantic Ocean. North America drifted slowly to the west. Africa and South America began to pull away from each other. The ancient Tethys Sea expanded. It grew like a wedge between the northern and southern landmasses. This continental drift, slow and steady, created new features. Vast rift valleys opened up in the land. They were desolate, raw wounds in the Earth's crust. New coastlines were drawn by the encroaching seas. Shallow, isolated inland seas began to form. Land that had been unified for 200 million years was now fragmented. Oceans and deserts emerged between what were once neighboring ecosystems. Imagine a single immense canvas. For ages it held a single sprawling painting. Now that canvas was being torn into pieces. Each piece would become a new, unique work of art. The climate, once monolithic, began to respond. The interior of Pangaea had been a place of extremes, vast deserts baked under a relentless sun. Winters were harsh and brutally cold. Rain rarely reached these desolate inner landscapes. Now, as the land broke apart, the air could move. The global climate shifted from extreme and seasonal to more varied. It became a world of regional weather patterns. Air masses once blocked by a single landmass flowed differently. Moisture from the new oceans was carried inland. Rain fell where it had failed to reach for millions of years. The great deserts began to shrink, their edges greened with new opportunistic life. New monsoon systems developed near the coasts. They brought reliable seasonal rains. This moisture transformed entire ecosystems. Lush tropical forests replaced dry, scrubby interiors. Humidity rose in many regions across the planet. This fed the explosive growth of plant life. It opened up new habitats, new niches, new possibilities. For the dinosaurs, this was a world of opportunity. Ecosystems diversified, and so did the dinosaurs living within them. With the fragmentation of land came the fragmentation of populations. This is a fundamental rule of evolution. Separation breeds diversity. Species that were once connected across a single continent became isolated. They were stranded on their own continental islands. This geographic isolation was a powerful creative force. Populations began to adapt to their new, unique surroundings. They evolved separately from their cousins on other landmasses. A dinosaur in what would become South America faced different challenges. It found different plants to eat. It faced different predators. Its relatives in emerging Africa were on their own path. Over immense spans of time, new species formed. Each one was uniquely suited to its specific region. This is how nature builds variety, not in stillness but in movement, not in sameness but in separation. In the landmass that is now North America, new giants stirred. New sauropods, the long-necked herbivores, began to evolve. Creatures like Apatosaurus and Camarasaurus would one day dominate these plains. Their ancestors were now setting out on that evolutionary journey. In Africa, a different branch of sauropods emerged. Dinosaurs like Vulcanodon appeared. They were pioneers in a new, isolated world. In Asia, a different story unfolded. The first stegosaurs, the plated dinosaurs, began to take form. Armored species, the ankylosaurs, also started their evolution here, and across all the spreading land masses the predators adapted. The theropods changed into countless new shapes. Some grew larger, chasing the growing herbivores. Others became more agile, hunting smaller, quicker prey. Still others became more intelligent, learning to solve new problems. This explosion of diversity was not a coincidence. It was directly tied to the geography of a world breaking itself apart. The oceans too were being reborn. As the continents drifted shallow, seas flooded inland. They created vast coastal habitats teeming with life. Sunlight penetrated the clear, shallow waters. This fueled the growth of algae and plankton. The very base of the marine food web was revitalized. Coral reefs began to expand in the warm equatorial waters. They created complex three-dimensional habitats. New marine reptiles emerged to take advantage of this growing abundance. Plesiosaurs glided through the water. Their long necks searched for fish and ammonites. Their flippered limbs propelled them with graceful power. Ichthyosaurs, shaped like sleek modern dolphins, darted through schools of prey. They were masters of speed and ambush in the open water. The sea became a new frontier for vertebrate life. Evolution answered the call with a host of new and strange creatures. The relentless volcanic activity continued to shape the earth. Lava fields blanketed huge areas, creating black, sterile deserts. Ash and gases periodically filled the skies. These volcanic plumes could have global effects. Sometimes they cooled the planet for years at a time. The ash and sulfur aerosols reflected sunlight back into space. This created short, sharp periods of global winter. Other times the gases warmed the planet. Carbon dioxide, a potent greenhouse gas, poured into the atmosphere. It trapped heat and raised global temperatures. These climatic fluctuations were devastating in the short term. They acted as an evolutionary filter, but they also fueled long-term evolutionary pressure. Species had to adapt quickly, or they would disappear. Those that could not handle the changing temperatures were lost. Those unable to cope with shifting coastlines vanished. Those unprepared for unpredictable rainfall patterns were left behind. They became ghosts in the fossil record. But the ones that could adapt flourished. The adaptable, the mobile, the efficient inherited this new world. The breakup of Pangaea also reshaped the very idea of travel. Dinosaur migration, once a journey across a single continent, became complex. New and permanent physical barriers appeared. Rivers fed by increased rainfall widened into impassable channels. Seas emerged where there was once dry land. Mountain ranges rose from the slow, violent collisions of tectonic plates. Ancient migration routes were severed forever. This limited the gene flow between populations. It prevented different groups from interbreeding. This further accelerated the process of speciation. Local ecosystems became more distinct and specialized. Predators evolved to hunt specific local prey. Herbivores adapted to eat the unique regional plant life. Over time, the biosphere became a rich mosaic. It was a collection of highly specialized creatures in specialized worlds. Not all of the changes were sudden or dramatic. Some were subtle, unfolding over millions upon millions of years. But the direction of change was clear. The old world of Pangaea had been a world of unity. It was often flat, hot, and uniform. Now it was being replaced by a new world of complexity. With that complexity came opportunity. New behaviors could evolve. New relationships between species could form. New ways of living became possible. This fragmentation even influenced social behavior. Herding, for example, became more common. As predators grew larger and more coordinated, there was safety in numbers. In fragmented landscapes, with forests and valleys, ambushes were a constant threat. A lone herbivore was an easy target. A vigilant herd offered protection against surprise attacks. Nesting behaviors also began to shift. Fossil evidence suggests more communal nesting sites. Dinosaurs gathered in specific locations to lay their eggs. This may have offered collective defense against egg thieves. Perhaps it was the first glimmer of primitive parental care. As environments became more diverse, so did social structures. While the dinosaurs rose in power and variety, others watched. Small mammals continued to evolve quietly in the underbrush. They were creatures of the night of the shadows. They scurried through ferns and beneath the roots of giant conifers. They avoided the giants that walked in the sun. Their time to rule the planet was still many millions of years away. But their own evolutionary foundation was being shaped. They too were part of this same dynamic world. The shattered Pangaea affected all life, great and small. As the Jurassic period truly began, Earth was a planet of motion. It was a world of constant transformation. Continents drifted steadily toward their modern positions. Climates cooled and warmed in long, slow cycles. Forests expanded and contracted with the shifting rains. Mountains rose and the seas deepened. Everywhere life followed these changes. Dinosaurs walked new paths across strange new lands. Each species was a branch on an evolutionary tree. That tree would grow to fill every available niche. What had once been a single colossal landmass was now a collection of evolving worlds. Each had its own rhythm, its own rules, its own destiny. This was the true legacy of a shattered Pangaea. It was not a story of destruction, but of diversification. It was not an ending, but a creation. In the cracks of this broken continent, life found new ways to thrive. They rose from the ancient floodplains. Their movement was slow, silent, but purposeful. They were towering shadows drifting across the landscape. Their long necks reached far above the treetops. Their sweeping tails carved paths through ancient ferns. Their feet, like massive pillars, pressed deep into the mud. They were shaping the land with every single step. They were the sauropods, the largest creatures to ever walk the earth. Their rise to dominance was not sudden. It was not an accident of history. It was the result of millions of years of slow, steady adaptation. It was a journey driven by hunger, by movement, and by the relentless pull of evolution. They were not simply born as giants. They became giants piece by piece, generation by generation. The early Jurassic was a world brimming with opportunity. Pangaea was breaking apart. The climate was becoming more humid and far more stable. Vast new ecosystems were opening up across the globe. Dense forests flourished in the increased rainfall. River deltas created rich, fertile wetlands. Coastal plains provided sprawling fields of low-growing vegetation. This created a vibrant mosaic of plant-rich environments. For a creature that needed to feed almost constantly, this was paradise. It was an endless planet-sized buffet. The first true sauropods emerged from their smaller ancestors. These ancestors were known as the sauropodomorphs. They began to explore this expanding world of green. Volcanodon was among the very earliest of these new giants. Found in the rocks of modern-day Zimbabwe, its name means volcano tooth. It was modest by the standards of its later relatives, yet it displayed the foundational traits of all sauropods. Its legs were thick and column-like, built to support immense weight. Its neck was already beginning to elongate. Its body showed a decisive shift toward obligate quadrupedalism. This means it walked exclusively on 4 legs. It was no longer built to rise on 2 legs like its ancestors. Its growing size demanded a new, more stable posture. Walking on all 4s provided that stability. Massive limbs supported its growing weight. Its neck gave it access to a wide feeding range. It could browse on different levels of foliage without needing to move its entire body. This was the beginning of a revolution in herbivory. It was a masterclass in energy efficiency. The sauropod neck was a marvel of biological engineering. It was flexible, powerful, and often longer than the rest of the body combined. This incredible structure allowed sauropods to feed high in the canopy, or it could sweep low across the ground like a giant rake. The strategy depended on the species and the environment. It meant less energy was spent walking from tree to tree. More energy could be gained from continuous feeding. This was a critical advantage for such a large animal. Unlike modern giraffes whose necks are constrained by blood pressure and a fixed number of vertebrae, sauropods had a different design. They evolved additional cervical vertebrae, adding more segments to the neck. More importantly, their bones were not solid. They were filled with air sacs, a feature called pneumatization. This is a trait they share with modern birds. These air-filled bones dramatically reduced the weight of the skeleton. It allowed for a longer neck and a larger frame without sacrificing strength. Their entire bodies were designed around two principles: efficiency and scale. Sauropods also possessed an unusually effective respiratory system. This was another secret to their success. Like birds, their lungs were connected to a complex system of air sacs. These sacs extended from the lungs into the hollow spaces in their bones. This allowed for a unidirectional flow of air. Air moved in a single loop through the respiratory system. It was not the simple in and out breathing of mammals. This one-way flow improved oxygen exchange dramatically. It provided the massive amounts of oxygen needed to power such a large body. It also helped to cool their enormous frames, preventing overheating. Their metabolism is still a topic of intense scientific debate. Were they warm-blooded like mammals or cold-blooded like reptiles? The answer is likely somewhere in between. They probably balanced energy conservation with rapid growth. This allowed juveniles to reach immense sizes in relatively short spans of time. A sauropod hatchling was small, perhaps the size of a goose. Within 2 decades, it could be a 40-ton giant. This rapid growth was a key defensive strategy. It meant less time spent being vulnerable to predators. A small sauropod was a meal. A large sauropod was a mountain. But this growth also meant greater and greater feeding demands. The lush landscapes of the Jurassic could now provide for that hunger. They did not feed alone. Sauropods lived and moved in herds. These groups sometimes numbered in the dozens or even hundreds. The evidence for this is etched in stone. Fossilized trackways found in Argentina, Portugal, and the United States reveal their movements. We can see parallel footprints all moving in the same direction. The stride lengths are consistent. The spacing between individuals suggests coordinated, not random movement. Herding offered powerful protection for the young. Juveniles likely walked in the center of the herd, shielded by the massive bodies of the adults. Perhaps there were even complex social bonds among the adults. We see sentinels, hierarchies, and cooperation in modern herd animals like elephants. It is possible the sauropods had similar social structures. Their movements physically shaped the land they walked upon. They trampled ferns into open meadows, creating new types of habitat. Their droppings produced in immense quantities fertilized the soil. They were ecosystem engineers long before the term existed, and the predators of this world took notice. The rise of the sauropods created a ripple effect in evolution. It was an arms race. To hunt something so massive, carnivores had to adapt. Early theropods began to grow larger. Their jaws became stronger, their teeth longer. They may have become more coordinated, learning to hunt together. But even at their most powerful, few predators would dare to take on a healthy adult sauropod. Their size alone was their primary defense. A single kick from a sauropod's leg could crush a predator's skull. A swipe of their massive whip-like tail could break bones. So the hunters focused on the vulnerable. It was the juveniles, the sick, and the isolated that drew their attention. And so sauropods developed strategies to protect their own. They formed tighter herds. They coordinated their movements. Perhaps they even used vocal communication. Low-frequency rumbles too deep for human ears to hear could have traveled for miles. These sounds could warn of danger or keep the herd together. They spread across the breaking world. Wherever there was abundant plant life and room to move, sauropods arrived. Mamenchisaurus appeared in Asia. Its neck stretched over 15 meters, more than half its total body length. Cetiosaurus, the so-called whale lizard, lived in the rivers and floodplains of Europe. In Africa, the sturdy jobaria wandered the open plains. South America hosted a growing variety of forms. This included the early ancestors of the titanosaurs. This group would one day come to dominate the Cretaceous period. Their success was not due to aggression or speed, it was due to persistence. They did not need to hunt. They needed only to feed and to grow. They were creatures of rhythm and cycle. They followed the seasonal rains moving between dry and wet habitats. They likely remembered the locations of water sources. They would have returned to them year after year. They migrated in search of fresh vegetation. They carved ancient enduring paths into the land itself. Their lives were shaped by the slow cycles of the planet, the cycle of growth, of movement, of reproduction. A single individual might live for many decades. It would watch the world shift slowly around it. Yet for all their incredible size and power, they were vulnerable. Their lives were filled with constant peril. Eggs laid in shallow nests could be destroyed by floods. They could be trampled by other animals. Or they could be eaten by opportunistic predators. Juveniles, even those the size of large cows, were still targets. A broken leg for a creature of this size was a death sentence. A prolonged drought could force an entire herd into starvation. Being large came with a significant cost. They survived by minimizing risk, not by eliminating it entirely. Still, they endured. Their bones scattered across every modern continent tell a story. It is a story of quiet dominance. It is the story of animals who did not need to chase or flee. They shaped the world simply by existing within it. They were the living pulse of the Jurassic landscape. Their presence was as steady and as unrelenting as a heartbeat. The rise of the sauropods marked a critical turning point. It was a new chapter in the age of dinosaurs. It proved that sheer size could be a successful evolutionary strategy. It showed that slow and steady could triumph over fast and fierce. It opened the door for the later giants of the Jurassic, the Seismosaurus, the Argentinosaurus, the Brachiosaurus, creatures so immense they seemed to defy the laws of biology. But it all began here in the early Jurassic. It began with the first tentative steps of a few long-necked grazers. They walked in a world freshly broken and blooming with new life. In the shattered remnants of Pangaea, the sauropods rose, and the world rose with them. As the great herds of sauropods grew larger, their presence rewrote the laws of survival. They were so dominant, they became a force of nature. They reshaped the land itself. They drew new lines of migration across entire continents. They transformed once diverse habitats into vast managed feeding grounds. But in their immense shadow, something else was evolving. Something leaner, sharper, and faster. For every giant that grazed peacefully in the open, a predator waited nearby. It was adapting, refining its skills and learning. This was the era of the new hunters. It was a rising class of theropod dinosaurs. They would redefine what it meant to kill in the Jurassic world. The old guard of apex predators had faded away. A power vacuum had been left at the top of the food chain. The Rauisuchians, crocodile-like archosaurs, were once the top predators of the Triassic. Now they had vanished. Their downfall came not from a climactic battle. It came from time and from change. Their massive bodies were slow to develop. Their adaptability was limited. These traits doomed them when the world shifted beneath their feet. Into that opening the theropod dinosaurs had already begun to step. Now, in the early Jurassic, they took complete control. Among the first to truly emerge and claim this new mantle was Dilophosaurus. Its fossil remains are found in the American Southwest. It was a predator built for a new kind of warfare. Its build was slender and graceful. Its long legs were made for running, and its skull was adorned with distinctive twin crests. These crests were likely for display, not combat. They might have been brightly coloured to attract mates or intimidate rivals. Dilophosaurus measured over 6 meters in length, but it weighed far less than its size might suggest. Its body was a masterpiece of lightweight construction. Its bones were hollow, filled with air, much like a bird's. This made it agile and quick on its feet. Its jaws were long and flexible, not built for crushing bone. They were lined with sharp, curved teeth, perfect for slicing flesh. Dilophosaurus was not a brute force killer. It did not rely on overwhelming power. It was a strategist, a thinking predator. It hunted with precision, relying on stealth, speed, and timing. This predator roamed the river, valleys, forests, and floodplains of its world. It may have hunted in pairs or even small, loosely organized groups. This coordination would have allowed it to bring down larger prey. It likely employed ambush tactics, striking from the cover of dense ferns. It could attack and then retreat quickly if the fight was too dangerous. Its speed allowed it to test its prey. It could probe for weakness without committing to a fight it might lose. It fed on the early ornithischians, the small plant eaters of its time. It hunted young sauropodomorphs who had strayed from the herd. It probably also scavenged when the opportunity presented itself. A dead or dying animal was an easy meal not to be wasted. It was an opportunist, not a specialist. And in a rapidly changing world that was its greatest strength, the success of predators like Dilophosaurus was rooted in their adaptability. Their bodies were modular, a collection of traits that could change rapidly. They could evolve quickly in response to environmental pressures. This is the engine of natural selection. Longer limbs appeared, allowing for faster running. Sharper, more recurved teeth evolved for more efficient killing. Stronger tails provided better balance during high-speed pursuits. Their eyes began to shift forward on their skulls. This provided better depth perception and binocular vision. These traits could shift and improve over just a few generations. They were fine-tuned by the relentless forces of survival. The result was a diverse family of predators. They could take on any role the ecosystem demanded. As the sauropods grew ever larger, so too did the challenge of hunting them. Few predators, if any, could face a full-grown adult head-on. That would be suicide. Instead, the new hunters focused on the edges of the herds. They targeted the young, the old, and the sick. They learned to follow the great herds from a safe distance, watching and waiting. They learned the rhythms of migration. They understood where the herds would go for water and for food. They learned the vulnerability of the nesting grounds. Fossil sites suggest that predators congregated near these breeding areas. They would wait for the eggs to be laid or for the hatchlings to emerge. It was a time of great feasting and great danger. These predators were not just mindless killers. They were observers. They were patient and calculating. Some of these theropods began to show clear signs of social behavior. Fossil trackways in China and the western United States are particularly revealing. They show parallel movement patterns, multiple individuals traveling together at matching speeds. Was this true pack hunting like we see in modern wolves, or was it simply a temporary alliance of convenience? The answer is still unclear, but it points to an emerging intelligence. These were no longer just solitary ambush predators. They were beginning to think, to interact, and to coordinate their actions. Their intelligence was supported by a growing brain size relative to their body mass. Theropods developed increasingly complex sensory systems. Their world was a rich tapestry of sights, sounds, and smells. They could see farther than their ancestors. They could hear better, picking up the low-frequency sounds of moving herds. They could smell more acutely, detecting prey from a great distance. Their skulls housed large optic lobes, the part of the brain that processes vision. This suggests a high degree of visual acuity. Their inner ears were sensitive to balance and fine movements. They became more aware of their surroundings. They were more capable of responding to subtle changes in prey behavior or the terrain. They were not just reacting to the world anymore, they were reading it, interpreting it, and predicting it. Competition among these new hunters was undoubtedly intense. Multiple theropod species often shared the same habitat. This led to niche partitioning, another evolutionary strategy. Some evolved to be generalists, feeding on a wide range of prey. Others became specialists. They focused on fish, small reptiles, or even carrion. Their bodies began to reflect these choices. Some developed long, narrow jaws, like modern crocodiles, perfect for snatching fish. Others evolved stout skulls and powerful necks for delivering crushing bites. The diversity of their physical forms mirrored the diversity of their strategies. As the Jurassic period progressed, this diversity only increased. New species emerged across the globe, each one adapting to its own unique environment. In Africa, the mighty Megalosaurus began its rise. In Asia, the early ancestors of the later Allosaurs took shape. North America saw the spread of larger, more robust theropods. And throughout these regions, the arms race between predator and prey accelerated. This constant escalation shaped every single aspect of life. The herbivores began to evolve more sophisticated defensive adaptations. They developed thicker skin and bony scutes. Some evolved tail clubs or spikes. Their herd behavior became more complex and coordinated. They began nesting in more heavily guarded, defensible sites. Even their reproductive strategies may have changed. Laying more eggs more often might have been a response to high predation pressure. The presence of intelligent, coordinated hunters forced the prey species to evolve. They had to change not just physically but behaviorally as well. The impact of these predators went beyond simple biology. They altered the very flow of energy through the ecosystem. Their kills fed not just themselves, they provided food for a whole community of scavengers. Insects, small mammals, even other dinosaurs benefited. Their presence regulated the herbivore populations. This prevented overgrazing and the destruction of forests. They drove movement, keeping the herds mobile and healthy. They pushed species into new territories, encouraging further diversification. They were not just consumers of life, they were catalysts for change. And through it all, they themselves kept changing. The theropod body plan was not static. It was a blueprint that was constantly being refined. It continued to evolve, becoming ever more efficient, ever more deadly. From this dynamic lineage would one day emerge the giants of the late Jurassic. Allosaurus, Ceratosaurus, and much later, the mighty Tyrannosaurus. And further still, down another smaller path, a different destiny awaited. The small, feathered hunters that would eventually give rise to birds. It all began here in the early Jurassic. It began in the age of the new hunters. They did not roar with the brute strength of the old tyrants. They whispered through the underbrush. They waited and they watched. And when the moment was right, they struck with deadly precision. Their rise was quiet, calculated, and utterly unstoppable. Beneath the towering necks of the sauropods, life began from the ground up. Beneath the stalking gaze of the theropods, a silent kingdom thrived. The true architects of the Jurassic world were not the creatures that roared or ran. They were the plants that swayed gently in the wind. They caught the light of the sun and fed the entire web of life. Without them, the dinosaurs would never have grown so large or so numerous. During the early to mid-Jurassic, the landscape was dominated by two primary plant kingdoms, the fern prairies and the conifer forests. Together, they created the lush green stage upon which the dinosaur empire expanded. The Earth during this time was a greenhouse world. It was warmer and more humid than it is today. Pangaea was still drifting apart, a slow geological dance. Volcanic activity constantly reshaped the terrain and enriched the atmosphere. This unique climate nurtured widespread rainfall across many regions. This abundant moisture allowed plant life to thrive. It was a level of growth unseen since the Carboniferous period. Flowering plants, the angiosperms that dominate our world today, had not yet evolved. Their ancestors had built a green empire of their own. It was an empire that was tougher, older, and deeply intertwined with dinosaur evolution. The open lowlands, the vast floodplains, and the wide river valleys were covered. They were carpeted in thick, dense mats of ferns. These ancient plants had no flowers, no seeds, and no true wood. They reproduced using spores which were carried on the wind. They spread rapidly wherever moisture was abundant. Their leaves or fronds stretched across the ground in vast, tangled networks. They carpeted the soil between the tall trees. They filled the spaces created by canopy gaps, and they rebounded with incredible speed after floods or fires. These were the fern prairies. They were sprawling fields of dense green life. They fed countless herbivores with every single bite. The ferns were the staple diet for many early plant-eating dinosaurs. Stegosaurs, the plated dinosaurs, grazed on them constantly. Early ornithopods, the bipedal herbivores, also relied on them. Even the juvenile sauropods would have fed on these low-growing plants. Their leaves were close to the ground, easy to harvest. They grew back quickly after being trampled or consumed. Because they grew in such thick, widespread patches, ferns allowed the herds to stay in one place for longer. They didn't have to exhaust their food supply and immediately move on. By modern standards, ferns are not particularly nutritious. But for creatures with massive stomachs and slow fermenting digestion volume, mattered more than quality. These fern prairies also played a key role in shaping movement and behavior. The great herds would follow the seasonal growth of the ferns. They would return to the most fertile valleys after the monsoon rains had passed. The predators in turn followed the herds. The scavengers followed the predators. and everywhere the ferns just kept growing. They were quietly driving the fundamental rhythm of survival. But not all of the Jurassic world was open space. Rising high above the endless fields of ferns stood another kingdom. This was the kingdom of the forests dominated by conifers. These trees were the ancestors of modern pines, redwoods, and cypresses. They dominated the uplands, the hillsides, and the mountainous regions. They reached incredible heights. Their trunks were thick enough to support dozens of meters of vertical growth. Their branches stretched outward like great spoked wheels. They caught the sunlight and cast deep shadows on the forest floor below. Their needles were tough and waxy. This design helped them conserve moisture and resist the constant grazing of herbivores. They were not easy food to eat, but for the largest dinosaurs they were absolutely essential. The sauropods evolved their long necks not only to feed high, they needed to reach deep into these dense conifer canopies. Some species browsed on the outer branches. They stripped away the needles with specialized comb-like teeth. Others may have fed on the large, nutrient-rich cones. These would have been easier to digest than the woody branches. Their sheer height allowed them to exploit a food source that was unreachable to all other herbivores. In doing so, they created distinct layers within the ecosystem. There were feeding zones separated by elevation. Stegosaurs and small ornithischians grazed low on the ferns. Iguanodons and other medium-sized herbivores browsed on mid-height shrubs and cycads, and high above the sauropods harvested the trees. Beneath the dense canopy, the forests were alive with more than just dinosaurs. Ancient insects swarmed in the undergrowth. Dragonflies with huge wingspans hunted smaller prey. Millipedes and beetles fed on decomposing pine needles on the forest floor. Early mammals darted through complex root systems and rotting logs. They typically fed at night, hiding from the dangers of the day. Amphibians lingered near the streams and ponds that crisscrossed the forest. Pterosaurs, the flying reptiles, nested in high branches or on inaccessible rocky ledges nearby. The forest was not just a backdrop for the dinosaurs. It was a complex, layered system of life. It was bound together by the trees themselves. Fire was a regular and important part of this world. During the dry seasons, lightning strikes would have been common. They would ignite the dry undergrowth, starting massive wildfires. These fires cleared away old dead growth. They released valuable nutrients back into the soil, and they opened up the canopy, allowing sunlight to reach the forest floor. The ferns, ever opportunistic, were often the first plants to regrow. The conifers, with their thick bark and resinous cones, were built to survive. Some species even required the intense heat of a fire to open their cones and release their seeds. This cycle of fire and renewal shaped the evolution of both plants and animals. Creatures that could move fast or burrow deep into the ground had better chances of survival. The dinosaurs learned to migrate away from the fires or simply wait them out. Life in the Jurassic was adapted to the burn. Plant distribution followed the lines of geography. In the coastal regions where soils were sandy and salty, only the hardiest species could grow. Inland floodplains, fed by rich sediment from the rivers, supported lush fern prairies and small groves of trees. The volcanic uplands were rich in minerals but prone to erosion. These areas fostered dense forests of conifers, ginkgos, and cycads. Wherever the land allowed it, the plants took root. And wherever the plants grew, the dinosaurs followed. The plants also played a critical role in regulating the global climate. The vast forests absorbed immense amounts of carbon dioxide. They released the oxygen that the giant animals needed to breathe. Their deep root systems stabilized the soil, preventing erosion. Their presence helped to trap moisture in the ecosystems, increasing local humidity. And as they died, decomposed and fossilized, they became part of the rock itself. They helped form the layers of stone and carbon that would one day record this ancient world. The fossil record preserves their incredible legacy. Entire mats of ferns have been found fossilized in fine-grained mudstone. Upright tree trunks petrified where they once stood still bear the marks of their ancient bark. Fossil pollen grains viewed under powerful microscopes reveal the spread of plant species across the ancient continents. Even dinosaur coprolites, their fossilized droppings, tell a story. They contain tiny fragments of chewed ferns and broken conifer needles. This offers a direct, undeniable link between the plant and the animal. In many ways, the rise of the dinosaurs was only possible because of the rise of these specific plants. The vast herds of the Jurassic did not feed on air. They fed on ferns and conifers, on cycads and ginkgos. They fed on the quiet, rooted life that had mastered the art of turning sunlight into growth. These plants were the absolute foundation of the food web. They were the architects of the ecosystems. They were the silent green forces that powered the age of monsters. The fern prairies and the conifer forests were not just scenery, they were survival. And as long as they continued to grow, the age of dinosaurs could continue its ascent. In the incredible age of dinosaurs, survival depended on more than just size. It was about more than speed or raw strength. It also depended on strategy. It depended on behavior shaped not by instinct alone, but by learning, communication, and adaptation. The Jurassic world was not just a simple battleground of bodies, it was a complex theatre of evolving minds. In the shifting, diverse landscapes of this time, the dinosaurs began to change. They changed not just in their physical form, but in their very thoughts. Behavioral evolution is incredibly difficult to trace in the fossil record. Bones can tell us where powerful muscles once attached. They show us how joints moved, how creatures walked or ran. But behavior, the things that dinosaurs actually did, is much more ephemeral. How they reacted, how they lived together, how they raised their young. This story is written in faint traces. It is found in footprints in nesting grounds, and in rare glimpses of moments frozen in time. These traces suggest that as dinosaurs diversified, their behaviors became far more complex. One of the most critical changes was the evolution of herding and complex group dynamics. Fossilized trackways perfectly preserved in ancient riverbeds and floodplains reveal these patterns. We see dozens of individuals moving in the same direction at the same pace. Their footprints overlap in regular, predictable intervals. This wasn't chaos. It was organized, coordinated motion. It was clear evidence of herds. Sauropods, stegosaurs, and some of the ornithopods likely moved in groups. They did this for safety and for better access to resources. Young dinosaurs would have been especially vulnerable to the new intelligent predators. Being in a herd offered powerful protection. The more eyes watching for danger, the less chance of a successful surprise attack. The more bodies moving together, the harder it became for a predator to isolate a single target. For a young dinosaur, being part of a group could mean the difference between life and death. But this group behavior may have extended beyond simple movement. Nesting grounds discovered in places like Argentina and Mongolia show evidence of communal egg-laying. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of nests are arranged in tight clusters. Each one contains carefully laid eggs. Some of these sites show signs of repeated use year after year. New nests were dug directly above the old ones from previous seasons. These were not random, haphazard deposits. They were colonies' established nesting sites. This suggests that some dinosaurs returned to the same locations generation after generation. They were driven by memory, by tradition, or by the pull of seasonal cycles. Parental care also appears to have evolved in some species during this time. Fossils of adult dinosaurs have been found very near to their nests. Some have even been found positioned protectively over their eggs. This hints at the possibility of active guardianship. The extent of this care is still hotly debated by scientists, but the pattern suggests something more than simple abandonment after laying the eggs. In species like Maiasaura, which would appear much later in the Cretaceous period, the fossil evidence is clear. It shows adults actively feeding and tending to their hatchlings in the nest. If this advanced behavior had its roots in the Jurassic, it marks a major evolutionary milestone. It represents the emergence of complex family dynamics in reptiles. The predators were evolving their own sophisticated behaviors. Theropods, like Dilophosaurus and the early megalosaurs, may have hunted in coordinated groups. This would have been especially important when they were targeting larger, more dangerous prey. Fossilized footprints again provide tantalizing clues. They hint at multiple individuals moving together, possibly in pursuit of a single target. Coordinated hunting requires communication. This could have been through visual cues, body language, or perhaps even vocalizations. It was no longer enough for a predator to be fast or strong. They had to be aware, reactive, and sometimes even cooperative. Communication itself was likely evolving across many different species. Vocal cords do not fossilize, but the shape of skulls and nasal passages can give us clues about sound production. The hollow crests on some dinosaurs, like Dilophosaurus, may have acted as resonating chambers. They could have amplified calls or been used for low-frequency rumbling. Bright color patterns displayed on skin plates or frills could have played a role in visual signaling. These signals could attract mates, warn off rivals, or identify members of a group. Social animals always benefit from the ability to be clearly seen and heard, and the dinosaurs were becoming more social than ever before. Territorial behavior also emerged as the Jurassic ecosystems grew more crowded. Trackways and the distribution of fossils suggest that certain species kept to specific regions. Predator-prey relationships developed within these defined zones. The herbivores followed the seasonal growth of plants, but they returned to known familiar areas. Competition for resources like water, food, and good nesting sites led to the development of boundaries. It led to dominance displays and to strategies of conflict and avoidance. Some dinosaurs likely used their immense size or loud sounds to warn away rivals before engaging in a physical fight. Others may have resorted to direct combat. They might have locked horns or swung their powerful tails in shows of strength. Even their sleep patterns may have evolved in response to environmental pressures. Small dinosaurs that lived in regions with large predators may have adopted nocturnal behaviors. They would have foraged for food under the relative safety and cover of darkness. The size of fossilized eye sockets can reveal the relative size of the optic lobes. This gives scientists clues about their capacity for night vision. Some species were clearly built for the daylight, others for the twilight hours. Intelligence, though very hard to quantify from fossils, was advancing. The theropods in particular began to show signs of higher brain-to-body mass ratios. This does not mean they were self-aware or capable of abstract thought, but it does suggest better motor coordination, faster learning, and more complex problem-solving abilities. These traits would later culminate in the highly intelligent raptors of the Cretaceous, but their evolutionary roots may have stretched far back into this period of Jurassic experimentation. Across all species and across all the new continents, dinosaurs were testing new strategies. They were not static, unthinking creatures locked in primal, unchanging routines. They were evolving complex behaviors shaped by experience, by their environment, and by their interactions with each other. Their minds, just like their bodies, were being sculpted by the demands of survival. The changing world of the Jurassic demanded more than just raw power. It demanded adaptability, cooperation, and awareness. The dinosaurs answered this call. They began to form communities. They began to protect their young. They began to learn in their own ancient way how to live, not just as individuals. They were learning to live as members of a greater interconnected whole. In the silence of the communal nesting grounds, we see evidence of this. In the long, worn trails carved into the earth by migrating herds, we see their legacy. In the cautious circling steps of predators sizing up their prey, we see a thinking mind at work. We see more than just a struggle for survival. We see evolution at work, not just in the shape of bone or the size of a tooth, but in thought itself. And that mental evolution would carry forward, shaping the creatures that would someday inherit the entire Earth. The Jurassic world was not a gentle place. It was a land of stark contrast of powerful opposites living side by side. Scorching hot days were often followed by surprisingly cold nights. Lush, humid forests were shadowed by desolate, arid plains. Quiet, peaceful nesting grounds could be interrupted by violent, unpredictable storms. To live in this era was to endure a planet that was constantly shifting between comfort and chaos. The animals that survived here did so not because the world was easy. They survived because they were masters of adapting to its extremes. As Pangaea continued its slow, inexorable breakup, the geography of the planet changed dramatically. Massive rift valleys formed between the separating continents. They were raw volcanic scars on the planet's surface. The creation of new coastlines brought in warm, moist air from the oceans. This fed thick clouds and brought long, seasonal rains to once dry lands. Vast inland deserts still dominated the central regions of the new continents, but now they were often surrounded by wide belts of tropical vegetation. In the space of just a few hundred kilometers, the climate could swing wildly. It could change from arid and hostile to wet and abundant. These sharp regional climates were the direct result of continental drift. They were caused by changes in ocean circulation and by constant volcanic activity. The land itself was a dramatic patchwork of extremes. Volcanoes were one of the defining forces of this time. Even after the initial massive pulse of eruptions that shattered Pangaea, volcanic activity remained constant. Magma seeped up through the deep rifts in the Earth's crust. It formed new mountain ranges and blanketed the ground in thick layers of ash. Lava flows could destroy entire forests in a matter of days, but they also left behind incredibly fertile ground for new growth. The skies often turned a hazy orange and red. This was not from beautiful sunsets, but from smoke and suspended particles. Dinosaurs living near these active volcanic zones had to migrate frequently. They often had to abandon nesting grounds or familiar food sources with very little warning. Many would have never returned. Yet where death struck, life often rebounded, sometimes even stronger than before. These eruptions also had a profound effect on the global climate. Each major volcanic event released enormous clouds of ash and sulfur dioxide high into the atmosphere. This material could block out the sunlight for years at a time. Temperatures around the world would drop. This temporary cooling is known as a volcanic winter. It would have hit the tropical and temperate ecosystems very hard. Some species adapted by slowing down their metabolism or altering their reproductive timing. Others simply vanished from the face of the Earth. In these cooler years, only the most resilient and adaptable creatures could endure. But the cold never lasted forever. When the ash finally settled out of the atmosphere, a different effect took over. The greenhouse gases from the same eruptions began to dominate. Carbon dioxide surged in the atmosphere, trapping the sun's heat. The poles were free of ice, so there were no major reflectors to bounce sunlight back into space. Global temperatures began to climb again, often higher than before. Sea levels rose with the warming temperatures. Tropical storms fed by the warmer oceans likely became more violent and frequent. This constant yo-yo of cooling and heating created a kind of environmental whiplash. Entire species that had evolved to handle the heat were then wiped out when the world suddenly went cold. Others that thrived in the cooler climates were pushed to extinction when the temperatures soared once again. Water itself was a source of extremes. In some regions, massive flooding was a constant threat. The rivers overflowed with every monsoon season. They spread nutrient-rich sediment across the floodplains, which was good for the plants. But these floods also drowned nesting grounds and washed away the young. Elsewhere, droughts could stretch on for months or even years. Lakes dried up into cracked, barren mudflats. The plants withered and died. The great herds had to move or they would starve. Fresh water became one of the most precious and contested resources in these long cycles. Dinosaurs that could travel long distances or tolerate thirst had a significant advantage. Others clustered around the few permanent water sources, competing fiercely for territory. Fire, too, was a frequent and powerful visitor. In the dry seasons, wildfires would have swept through the fern prairies and conifer forests. Lightning strikes would ignite acres of dry vegetation in an instant. For many species, fire was a terrifying threat. But for others, it was an opportunity. Some plants evolved to regrow very quickly after a burn. Others actually used the fire to help them spread their seeds. The herbivores would return to the scorched fields to feed on the fresh new growth that followed. The dinosaurs did not fight the fire. They learned to live with it, to move with it, to benefit from it. These environmental extremes shaped more than just survival. They shaped behavior, biology, and movement. Species that had once stayed in one place their whole lives became migratory. Those that had once relied on a single type of food source had to broaden their diets. Some began nesting in more protected areas like caves or high cliffs. Others evolved new physical traits like longer limbs or larger lungs to move farther and faster in search of safety. These were not optional changes. They were the non-negotiable cost of existence in this world. Temperature swings also influenced physical traits. In the warmer climates, some dinosaurs may have developed larger surface areas to help dissipate heat. Longer tails, wider frills, or thinner bodies could act as radiators. In the cooler zones, some may have developed insulation. The very first feather-like structures may have emerged not for flight but simply for warmth. Small theropods living in variable climates needed a way to retain their body heat. Their bodies responded by evolving simple filaments, a primitive form of what would later become true feathers. These early adaptations show how temperature shaped not just behavior but the very form of life itself. Some species learned to take advantage of the extremes. The pterosaurs used the rising columns of hot air called thermals that formed over the hot terrain. They could use these to soar for hours without ever flapping their wings. Aquatic reptiles may have timed their reproduction with the seasonal floods. This would allow their young to grow in temporary predator-poor wetlands before the dry season returned. The early mammals foraged at night to avoid both the daytime heat and the larger daytime predators. Even the insects evolved to hatch during specific weather windows, taking advantage of brief periods of rain or warmth. The entire ecosystem began to operate on dramatic cycles of boom and bust. It was a world of abundance followed by scarcity. These extremes also carved the future of the planet's surface. Erosion from the heavy rains cut deep canyons into the landscape. Ancient lava flows redirected the courses of major rivers. Shifting climate zones pushed the forests northward and drove the deserts into once fertile land. And through all of this chaos, the dinosaurs moved. They did not conquer the land by brute force alone. They followed it, they watched it, they remembered its patterns. They learned to return to the nesting sites that had survived the floods of the past. They learned to avoid the volcanoes that had burned the generations before them. Their survival was tied not just to raw instinct, but to a growing collective awareness of the patterns in their world. The fossils tell us this story not in words but in layers of rock. We see alternating bands of volcanic ash and lake sediment. We see tree trunks petrified exactly where they stood, preserved by a sudden smothering lava flow. We see bones found in dense clusters, indicating a herd that died together in a sudden flash flood. We see the ripple marks in stone left by the drying ponds after a long and terrible drought. These details speak of a planet that was constantly in motion. It was moving not only physically but also ecologically. A world of extremes does not favor the strongest. It favors the most adaptable. In the Jurassic, this meant constant change was the only constant. It meant that the creatures who could move, who could grow, who could respond, were the ones who survived. They had to endure not just in times of abundance, but in times of absence as well. The dinosaurs that thrived here did so because they learned to live in the very rhythm of the extremes. They did not resist the chaos of their world. They became a part of it. And in doing so, they rose to become the most successful land animals the Earth had ever seen. They had survived a great extinction. They had conquered the extremes of a changing planet. They had learned to adapt to fire, to flood, and to famine. Now, with the world reshaped and the stage cleared of their ancient competitors, the dinosaurs began to diversify. They expanded in every possible direction. This was not just simple growth in numbers. It was an evolutionary explosion. It was a sudden global radiation of new forms, new sizes, new behaviors, and new strategies. They did not simply fill the ecological niches that were left behind by other animals. They created entirely new ones. This was the great dinosaur explosion. It began quietly at first. In the early Jurassic, the dinosaurs were already spreading across the globe. Their numbers were rising, their bodies becoming more specialized. But as Pangaea continued to fracture and the regional climates began to stabilize, something changed. The isolated populations began evolving in wildly different directions. What had once been a mostly uniform group of reptiles began to split. It broke apart into the distinct lineages that would shape the rest of the Mesozoic era. The theropods, the bipedal predators, diversified into both large and small forms. Some grew longer jaws and thicker necks, specializing in taking down large prey. Others became more gracile with lightweight frames and longer arms for chasing smaller, faster animals. In the different corners of the New World, distinct branches of the theropod family tree began to appear. The megalosaurs, the ceratosaurs, and the early allosaurs all took root during this time. They were laying the genetic foundation for the apex hunters that would follow them, and below them, in the undergrowth, even smaller forms emerged. There were quick-footed insectivores and general opportunists. They hunted in the shadows of the giants, scavenged carcasses or preyed on eggs and hatchlings. The sauropodomorphs, once slow and modest-sized herbivores, underwent dramatic changes. Some of their lineages began to grow at astonishing rates. Their bodies stretched out, becoming the immense four-legged giants that would dominate the Jurassic world. Their necks lengthened, their vertebrae expanded, and their legs thickened into mighty pillars. Sauropods like Cetiosaurus and Shunosaurus appeared in Africa and Asia. Each one was pushing the absolute limits of size and reach. As their bodies transformed, so did their feeding strategies. Some specialized in high browsing, reaching the tops of the conifer trees. Others swept their long necks from side to side, grazing on low-lying vegetation like giant lawnmowers. Their stomachs adapted to handle huge volumes of tough plant matter. Their lungs evolved to support their massive oxygen-hungry frames. The ornithischians, the so-called bird-hipped dinosaurs, began their own quiet revolution. Once they were small and unassuming creatures. Now, they branched out into a wide variety of new forms. The heterodontosaurs developed distinct types of teeth for different feeding styles. The early stegosaurs appeared with their backs lined with bony plates and their tails armed with sharp spikes. The ankylosaurs began developing their characteristic armor across their bodies. This was a direct evolutionary response to the growing threat of predation. These herbivores were not just passive prey animals. They were problem solvers, active defenders, and survivors in an increasingly dangerous world. This explosion of diversity was not just biological, it was ecological. Dinosaurs began occupying every single role in the ecosystem. They grazed in the open fern prairies. They browsed in the dense, dark forests. They hunted along the riverbanks and in the dry uplands. They nested in vast colonies, roamed in protective herds, and fought for dominance. They shaped the land not just by their immense presence, but by their complex interactions. The predators regulated the herbivore populations, keeping them in check. The herbivores in turn shaped the vegetation of the entire planet. Their movement patterns influenced the distribution of plants. Their different feeding strategies opened up space for new types of plants to evolve. The ecosystem became a complex, interconnected web of life. And the dinosaurs were sitting right at its center. The spread of the dinosaurs across the globe was also accelerating. As the continents drifted apart, species found themselves cut off from their old populations. They were exposed to new and different environments. This geographic isolation led to allopatric speciation. This is the formation of new species as groups adapt to their specific local conditions. In North America, certain sauropods developed broader bodies to support different feeding angles on the local flora. In Europe, some theropods adapted to the densely forested environments, growing shorter and more agile. In Asia, the ankylosaurs developed extremely dense armor and powerful tail clubs. This was to defend against the more agile predators that were common in that region. This was not a single monolithic explosion. It was thousands of localized evolutionary explosions happening all at once. Each one was shaped by its own unique geography, climate, and the passage of deep time. Even their reproductive strategies were evolving and diversifying. Nesting behaviors became more varied. Some dinosaurs laid their eggs in simple open sand pits. Others built complex mounds of vegetation to help incubate them. Still others used the safety of the large communal nesting grounds. The size of their clutches of eggs varied. The incubation times changed depending on the climate. The young dinosaurs began to show signs of staying with their parents for longer periods after hatching. Fossil evidence from certain sites shows adults found alongside hatchlings. This strongly suggests the emergence of care that extended beyond simply laying the eggs. This shift in reproductive behavior helped to ensure the survival of the next generation. This was especially important in unpredictable environments where predators constantly patrolled. New behaviors evolved alongside the new physical forms. Dinosaurs began displaying more complex social dynamics. The trackways suggest that herds moved in coordinated patterns. It is likely that dominant, more experienced individuals guided the group. Some species may have had complex vocal calls for communication. They could have been used for warning of predators or signaling group movement. Others may have used sophisticated body language. Postures, frills, or tail positions could have expressed aggression, attraction, or submission. The crests and horns seen on many dinosaurs were not just for defense. They may have served as powerful visual signals evolving for display as much as for survival. As the diversity of the dinosaurs grew, so did the complexity of their environments. The forests became more layered with different species living at different heights. The wetlands expanded, creating new habitats for both aquatic and semi-aquatic life. New types of plants evolved responding to the heavy grazing and browsing pressure from the herbivores. Cycads and ginkgos spread across the landscape. Horsetails and ferns rebounded quickly after the seasonal fires. The conifer forests adapted to the deep shade and the intense competition for sunlight. Entire ecosystems were now cycling around the movements and behaviors of the dinosaurs. This explosion also laid the groundwork for future evolutionary innovation. Feathers, which likely began as simple insulation in small theropods, may have started to diversify during this period. Though still primitive, these structures could have served multiple roles. They could regulate body temperature, aid in colorful displays, or even improve balance during fast movements. The very first tentative steps toward avian flight were beginning to form. They were happening quietly and without fanfare in the shadows of the larger dinosaurs. What made the dinosaur explosion so remarkable was its sheer scale and its incredible speed. Within just a few tens of millions of years, a mere blink in geological time, the dinosaurs changed. They went from being just a few adaptable survivors of an extinction to being the most dominant land animals on the planet. They did not just outlive their competitors, they completely replaced them. They changed the very rules of how life on Earth was lived, and this was only the beginning of their story. The Earth was no longer a single broken continent drifting aimlessly apart. It was becoming something new, something more complex and vibrant. It was becoming a world of rich ecosystems, diverse landscapes, and seemingly endless evolutionary potential. The explosion of dinosaur diversity had reshaped life across the entire planet, but it was only a preview of what was to come. The creatures that now roamed every corner of the Jurassic world were marching towards something even greater. This was the final lead-up to the golden age of dinosaurs. It was a time when their dominance would reach its absolute peak. Their influence would extend from the soil beneath their feet to the skies high above. In the final stages of the early Jurassic and the beginning of the Middle Jurassic, the planet was stabilizing. The massive world-altering volcanic eruptions that had shattered Pangaea were finally slowing down. The climate chaos they had caused was beginning to subside. Sea levels began to rise, steadily carving out new coastlines and feeding vast wetland ecosystems. The rainfall patterns became more predictable and reliable. The relentless, brutal extremes that had tested every single life form were now softening. They were settling into rhythms that favored growth, expansion, and specialization. It was in this precious window of relative calm that the dinosaurs began to flourish like never before. The sauropods, already enormous, began to dominate entire continents. Their bodies evolved into ever more efficient engines of herbivory. Their legs became thicker, more columnar to support their increasing weight. Their vertebrae developed more extensive air sacs, reducing their weight while maintaining their structural strength. Their tails, once used merely for balance, became new tools. They were used for defense, for communication, and possibly for coordination during their long migrations. Species like Cetiosaurus and Shunosaurus traveled in vast continent-spanning herds. They ate constantly as they crossed the floodplains and forests. They left behind wide trails of flattened vegetation and freshly fertilized ground. The presence of these massive animals had profound ecological impacts. The plants that they consumed had to evolve or they would vanish. Some developed tougher, more fibrous leaves. Others evolved to grow faster to recover from the intense grazing pressure. The movements of the sauropods opened up the dense forests. This allowed sunlight to reach the ground and encouraged the growth of new low-lying plants. Their dung enriched the soil, creating pockets of high fertility. Entire ecosystems, from the dung beetles to the small animals that fed on them, depended on the wake of the sauropod herds. They were no longer just participants in the ecosystem, they were actively shaping it on a continental scale. The predators responded to this new and growing abundance of food. The megalosaurs, the ceratosaurs, and the early allosaurs began to take their final forms. They grew larger, stronger, and smarter. They adapted their hunting strategies to take on the juveniles, or the weakened adults from the giant herds. Their senses became sharper, their limbs more muscular and powerful. Some developed crests and horns not just for display but for combat between rivals. Others refined their teeth and their claws for gripping flesh more efficiently. The age of specialization had truly arrived for the predators. No longer were they just opportunistic hunters. They were evolving into apex tacticians. They were becoming fine-tuned killing machines designed to take on the growing challenge of a world ruled by giants. The herbivores other than sauropods also evolved rapidly during this period. The stegosaurs, with their iconic backplates and spiked tails, began to thrive in the forested regions. They used their unique features for both defense and for thermoregulation, absorbing or releasing heat. The first armored ankylosaurs started to appear, their bodies turning into living fortresses of bone and keratin. Small bipedal ornithopods evolved longer legs and better coordination. This allowed them to outrun predators in the more open terrain. Each of these distinct groups filled new and different ecological roles. They ensured that no part of the vast plant kingdom was left unclaimed. Beneath their feet, the first true mammals quietly continued their own separate story. Though still small and largely nocturnal, they were diversifying too. They were feeding on insects, hiding in burrows, climbing trees, and adapting to life in the edges of the ecosystems where the dinosaurs could not easily reach them. Their presence was subtle but critically important. They were the silent witnesses of this golden age, waiting patiently for a time of their own. In the skies, the evolution of the pterosaurs was picking up incredible speed. Once they were awkward gliders clinging to the cliffs. Now they had become powerful active flyers. Species like Dimorphodon and Rhamphorhynchus soared over the coastlines. They fed on fish and insects nesting in high cliffs and the branches of the tallest trees. Their wings, formed from an elongated fourth finger and a stretched membrane of skin, were engineering marvels. Their hollow bones gave them the strength they needed to lift off, and they provided the lightness required to ride the thermal currents for miles on end. Some of them began to show signs of complex social behavior. They nested in large colonies or displayed elaborate crests for communication. They were the very first vertebrates to truly master the air. They were setting the stage for what would one day become bird-like flight. As the continents continued to drift, the dinosaurs followed them. They crossed the newly formed land bridges that sometimes connected the continents. They adapted to the unique conditions of island environments. They tracked the mighty rivers that wound their way between the new mountains and valleys. Each new terrain offered a unique set of challenges. And every one of those challenges led to new evolutionary forms. Isolation caused speciation. Environmental pressure drove innovation. The result was a steady, unstoppable march toward greater complexity. This remarkable time of stability allowed for another important shift. It allowed for the development of long-term stable ecosystems. Instead of constantly collapsing under the stress of climate change, the food webs began to stabilize. The prey and predator populations began to cycle in a predictable balance. The seasonal growth of plants returned like clockwork. Nesting patterns became predictable. Migration routes were established and passed down through generations. And with this new, reliable rhythm came a kind of evolutionary confidence. Dinosaurs could afford to grow larger. They could invest more energy in parenting. They could experiment with elaborate displays. They could expand their territory without fear of imminent collapse. The age of frantic experimentation was giving way to an age of mastery. Even the climate itself seemed to support this new world order. Global temperatures remained high, but they were consistent. The tropical zones stretched far into the continents. Ice was almost non-existent even at the poles. Lush forests blanketed much of the land. The shallow seas teemed with marine reptiles and abundant fish. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere remained high enough to support the massive animals and their active metabolisms. It was a world that seemed to be built for life at a grand scale, and the dinosaurs rose to meet that challenge. But this period of calm would not last forever. The Earth was always shifting, always preparing its next great test. The Middle Jurassic was only a prelude to what was coming next. In the Late Jurassic, the sauropods would reach their full, unimaginable potential. The allosaurs would dominate as the undisputed apex predators. The feathered theropods would begin to leap and glide, moving ever closer toward true flight. The Stegosaurus would wield its plated armor like a living shield. Ecosystems would stretch across every single corner of the globe, from polar forests to tropical swamps. The Golden Age was almost here. Towards this Golden Age, the story of the dinosaurs became a symphony. Each group was playing its own part in a world of motion, color, sound, and power. They had emerged from the long shadow of extinction. They had conquered the chaos of volcanoes and the violence of shifting continents. And now, with the planet at peace, for a precious moment in deep time, they were ready. They were ready to rise to their greatest heights. The Golden Age of dinosaurs was not a distant, impossible dream. It was just beyond the horizon. And they were already walking toward it.